Good afternoon and welcome to this NELRC webinar on addressing implicit bias. I'm Andy Nash, Director of the New England Literacy Resource Center, here with Cynthia Peters, Editor of The Change Agent. And we're going to be talking about implicit bias and what can be done to address it. Before I get to a definition of it, I want to note that implicit bias is in contrast to explicit bias, the positive or negative beliefs we hold that we are aware of. We know we have them. Implicit bias refers to attitudes and beliefs, positive or negative, about other people, issues, about how the world works, beliefs that occur outside of our conscious awareness and control and which affect our opinions and behavior. Everyone has implicit biases that they've developed over a lifetime. According to the definition we're sharing here, people can work to combat and change these biases. Some definitions say that these beliefs are not accessible through introspection, but we're going with this one and many others that suggest that through reflection we can surface and evaluate these deeply embedded attitudes, because our implicit biases might actually conflict with what we consciously believe. And that's why those implicit bias tests, which you may have taken, are often surprising to people because they're illuminating the contradictions between what we believe consciously and subconsciously. And there's another relevant bias to consider here, which is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias, or the selective collection of evidence, is our subconscious tendency to seek and interpret information and other evidence in ways that affirm what we already believe, and to ignore contradictory evidence. We see what we expect to see. So it's both affected by and feeds our implicit biases. And if you start looking, you'll see examples of confirmation bias all over the place.
I'm going to draw upon one from way back that many of you may recognize. So here's this riddle. I think they called it a riddle. So this is the one where it says, a father and son are in a fatal car crash. The father dies. The son is injured and taken to the hospital. And when he goes into the operating room, the surgeon comes in and says, I can't operate on this child. This is my son. And back in 2001, when I think this first came out, everyone was stumped. They could not figure out who this surgeon could be. It was like, oh, the father wasn't really dead, or it's really the stepfather. Well, nowadays, I don't think it really stumps us. Thank you, Connie. She got it, that the surgeon is the mother. But at the time, we were just swimming in a world where that didn't seem like a possibility. And so no one could see that. And so that was an example of confirmation bias. They couldn't see the possibility even though it was right in front of, we couldn't see it even though it was right in front of our faces. Yes, hard to see outside the box. So part of what confirmation bias does is that we don't check ourselves, and rather than testing our hypotheses or our beliefs and trying to find disconfirming evidence just to test, we tend to just seek to confirm what we already believe.
All right, so when we sent out the information about this webinar, we actually sent you a link to this Harvard implicit bias test, and I was wondering if anybody took it. It's a pretty interesting test. I took a few of them myself. And I see some people, I see Pam saying yes, she might have taken the test. Other people are saying yes, somebody had taken it previously. Yeah, this has been making the rounds for a long time, so you might be familiar with it. And I don't know about how you all fared in the test, but my biases definitely showed, and millions of people have taken this test, and with all the data that comes from this test, they feel like they're able to make some conclusions about people's implicit biases. I also just did some Googling and searching around about sort of criticisms of the test, and one of the criticisms that surfaced is that just because you show individual bias in one of these tests where it's kind of based on the speed of your reaction, it doesn't mean that you necessarily are, as an individual, going to behave in a discriminatory behavior. And so some sociologists say, well, what's the point of measuring implicit bias if it doesn't tell us anything about the individual person's behavior? And actually, even when it doesn't tell us something about the individual behavior, it might give us information about how a community or a society behaves. So more on that in a couple of slides. Another place where there's lots of data is when sociologists study the calls that referees make in the NBA. Now, this is a whole big thing. People might be familiar with this. I don't know. They track every single call made by every single ref in the NBA. And so there's tons of data here because these are split-second decisions that referees have to make. And so sociologists and economists love this data. And I've heard them talk about how they don't love basketball necessarily. They don't want to be studying basketball, but they love having access to the data. And what they've discovered is that, in fact, across the board, referees tend to favor the home team. And there's also racial bias evident among referees. The white referees favor white players and the black referees favor black players. And there's an interesting side note about this and about an idea about how this can be corrected, which we're going to touch on later in the webinar. So there's some good news there. But just to make it clear that whenever sociologists have access to sort of large amounts of data, they find that implicit bias, is quite real. And just to say about referees, they actually should be very motivated to not be biased because, they get pay raises and they get promotions depending on when somebody looks back over the tapes and sees how well they make the calls. That's how they get judged and ranked. So they're very motivated to not be biased. And even with that motivation, they still act on their bias. And it doesn't mean that they're individually racist or that they're individually kind of rooting for the home team. It just means that they're like any other human and they are susceptible to some unconscious bias. So those are two places where we can see lots of data. I was wondering if we could just get some more stories from some data from our webinar attendees today. What are some of your experiences with implicit bias now that you know a little bit about it? Unconscious bias that you might be walking around with, maybe a time when you might have expressed your unconscious bias, maybe a time when you witnessed somebody else's unconscious bias, or something that you might have experienced. You might have been at the receiving end of somebody else's unconscious bias towards you that you perceived. So this is something that Andy and I included in our description too. We wanted you to come to the webinar maybe prepared to share one of these. So I'm hoping a couple people might be able to put something in the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself, this is a moment for our experiment where we get to hear your voice and hear more voices from more people during a webinar, which often helps it be a little bit less deadly. So if anybody wants to unmute themselves and share a story very quickly, we would. Yeah, I guess you can't unmute yourself. Mike will unmute you. So yeah, I'm going to pause here for a minute and see if anybody is going to add something to the chat box, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can let us know and Mike will unmute you.
By raising your hand? Is that how they'll let you know?
Yeah, or actually, Mike, why don't you just unmute everybody right now, and we'll see if anybody, rather than have you raise your hand or something like that, we're just going to unmute everybody right now. So if you have a dog barking in the background, or if you're driving in your car, that might be a little noisy. But yeah, everybody should be unmuted now. Does anybody want to share a story?
Cynthia? Mm-hmm. Cynthia, this is Pam Meter.
Hi.
And my story is I was a high school teacher, and then I got into adult education, and I went to the certification office to renew my certification and was told I was not a teacher anymore because I was teaching adults. And that, to me, was a bias. Okay.
Wow.
Things have changed since then, but.
What do you think that bias was exactly?
Well, I think she assumed that because I was no longer teaching K through 12, that I was not a teacher in the sense of what the state recognized, I guess, even though I was doing the same thing, teaching the same subjects, just to different people.
maybe the implicit bias there is that real education only happens in K through 12 or for children.
Correct.
That's real. That's real education, and everything else is sort of some other category. Interesting.
Right.
Great. Thank you for sharing that story. Anybody else?
Hey, this is Heidi Schuler-Jones.
Hi, Heidi.
I've lived my entire life in Georgia, and my hometown is the headquarters for the KKK for Georgia, and they frequently have rallies. I've gone several years ago to protest at the rally and was standing in a mixed group of protesters and supporters, and there was this huge man next to me in overalls and a wife beater and a big cigar hanging out of his mouth, and I assumed he was there in support because he looked like most white men I had grown up with in my hometown, and he yelled out to the KKK members, "Go home, you rednecks." And it floored me. My bias. I assumed he was there because he fit a different stereotype for me.
Excellent. You got a chance to look at your own implicit bias right there.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. Great. Thank you for sharing that. Well, those were some good stories. Does anybody else want to add one?
Well, the chat box is going to stay open, so people can add whenever they want. So
Yes, please do. But I guess we'll just move on now as we continue exploring some of these ideas about implicit bias. So some background on this. We're all hardwired to make snap decisions about what is safe, comfortable, and valuable. And the reason for this is that, it's our survival is kind of linked to it, right? I mean, when we were, in ancient history walking down a path, you needed to have a very quick response to the saber-toothed tiger that might have come at you. Or if a person's coming in your direction, you need to make a very snap judgment about whether or not the situation is safe. And if you're crossing a street and you see something coming at you, you need to make a very snap judgment about getting out of the way. So our survival is wrapped up in making snap decisions. So we're all hardwired to do it. It doesn't make us bad that we do it. And like the referees in an NBA game, we all have countless discretionary moments in a day. And teachers especially, in the classroom, there's all these moments where we make decisions about how to act and towards a student, how to position ourselves, how to show kind of affirmation or disapproval, or what's the quality of our attention like towards a particular student. All of these things are discretionary moments in the classroom where our implicit bias might be showing itself. So here is a list of some of the ways that those biases show themselves. Like I already mentioned, the little micro affirmations. You find yourself nodding towards somebody, you find yourself making eye contact at them and smiling more. Or maybe there's micro devaluations. You don't pay as much attention, you look down, you look distracted, you look impatient, you're ready to move on. There's all sorts of ways you communicate in any particular moment. We also, all of us, have an affinity bias. We're drawn to people who we think are like us, whether they really are or not. We tend to be drawn to them. We tend to give them the benefit of the doubt. People who seem really different from us, we have less benefit of the doubt. We're more likely to fall into a negative view of that person. And a fourth thing, and this is a really big thing, is our underlying worldview, which is kind of the oxygen that we breathe, the atmosphere of our everyday life. And sometimes this is just the received ideology that we don't even question because it just seems like common sense. So one example of this that I was thinking about, because I'm the editor of The Change Agent, and I just produced a special issue on Indigenous peoples. And one thing that became really clear around that was that indigenous peoples almost across the world have a real value. They value reciprocity, and it shows up in all sorts of ways in their culture and in their society and in their relationship to nature and to each other. And I was thinking about how different that is than a sort of an American or U.S. approach, which is a lot more individualistic, a lot more based in competition. We have a high value on competition, a high value on the individual, a high value on individual achievement versus collective achievement. And this is not to judge these things one way or the other, but just to notice that if we go into a situation with a certain underlying worldview, it colors how we perceive things, and it's a form of bias. So yeah, those are some of the ways that unconscious bias comes out and the ways that it shows itself. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from everything that creates our culture, everything that creates messaging, like the media, like our family life, like going to our, attending to religious practices, whatever those might be, various life experiences that we might get in our family, our neighborhoods, obviously our school systems. So, these are some of the sources of where implicit bias comes from. Any questions there or comments? I'd like to pause and just see if there's anything in the chat box. I don't see anything right now. So good. What we can do now, and maybe Mike, if you could drop this URL into the chat box, that would be great, because then people could easily click on it. We don't have a way to show this video from within the webinar. So what we're going to ask you to do is click on the chat box when Mike gets that into the chat box. Click on the link and watch this short video. It's just about 4 or 5 minutes long. And then just come back into the webinar after you finish watching it. And it's going to give us more meat to talk about in terms of implicit bias. All right, is everybody clear on that? We'll see you in about 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Yeah. Self. Okay, it looks like a lot of people are back. So yeah, what did you think about that video? I guess maybe Mike, could you just unmute everybody again? Because I think that worked pretty well last time. And people, if you have any thoughts on the video, I'd love to hear.
And we have a big math crew on this video, on this webinar, so
a big math crew. Yeah. 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 So what did you think? What impressed you? I see Melissa says she appreciated the math. Yeah. Well, did you notice
how dedicated we are to what we believe, like how hard it is to not just go with what we already believe is true.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, people just keep over and over again saying different versions of the same theory, 5, 10, 20. 100, 200, 400. They just kept wanting to double. Yeah, some people are saying they fell into the trap of figuring out their relationships. Oh, Connie's used this video with teachers before, pausing it to have them participate. Oh, what a great idea. That's a great idea. So,
I mean, language that they were saying times 2. I was like, well, maybe it should be double. Maybe the times was double.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah, I thought too. I thought, well, maybe they kept saying 3 numbers. What happened if you said 4 numbers? Maybe his rule was just say 3 numbers. But my first reaction, and I think all of us that are the math people here were thinking, oh, we got to find that rule. We've done this before. We got to find the rule. So we didn't even think beyond that.
Right.
Yeah, it was cool.
That's interesting. Just say any 4 numbers.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I was, I was starting to think outside the box at that point.
Yeah, good. Excellent. Yeah. Great. I think that's the idea, is that even when you're kind of told repeatedly, nope, that's not the rule, you just, instead of thinking outside the box, you keep kind of trying different versions of the rule that you want it to be. So, yeah, our minds are powerful in that way. We're not always very flexible thinkers. So part of what Andy and I were trying to do in this webinar is kind of surface that fact, and then also we're going to get to the point where I'm going to put the microphone back to Andy, and she's going to share some ideas about what we can actually do about the ways that our minds get a little bit rigid and a little bit shut down. Okay, so let me move on to the next slide. So you might think, oh, so is implicit bias really a problem? And, the answer is yes. It's not a benign thing. It might help us in some ways. It might be something hardwired into our brains. But because of how society functions, it's not a totally benign thing. It's something that we need to put our attention to. So this, people may have seen this image before. This was in an actual, children's textbook that was published first in 2001 and then again in 2009. And, the white faces are demonstrating the adjectives happy and proud. The brown faces are demonstrating the adjectives sad and angry. That is not a coincidence. That's an example of implicit bias showing up. And it's showing up on the part of the person who created this page. And then it's reinforcing, for the people who consume the page, it's reinforcing this idea. So it's just going into our unconscious that this is how we can look at people. It's also true that, remember how I said it's not so much about individuals being biased and therefore they're going to go out into the world and behave in a discriminatory fashion? I mean, they might, but they also might not. What matters is the aggregate data. And so one thing they've discovered is that metro areas that have greater average implicit bias, they also have larger racial disparities when it comes to things like really important things like police shootings and also infant health. So overall, in a society where there's increased implicit bias, you do start to see the effects of it in the community. In the schoolroom, non-Black teachers of Black students have significantly lower expectations than do Black teachers of those same students. So that effect really builds up over time on the students, right? When you chronically, over the lifetime of your educational career, have lower expectations on you, you're going to achieve less, and you're going to have more obstacles to get over. And so that it has a big aggregate effect. They've done studies where they look at how teachers respond in online forums to people who participate in the forum who have a kind of classically white male name versus those who have female names or names that might be kind of construed to be African American. So the white men get responded to. And now this is just data. This isn't saying, that teacher is necessarily a racist human being, but for some reason he or she is, their implicit bias is showing, and they tend to, over time and over a period of courses, respond more to the white people who have white male names. What happens is not just that the teacher is behaving according to this implicit bias, but then the people who the bias is landing on start to internalize that they're less, for example, worthy of being responded to. They start to internalize messages about themselves. And they even, this thing starts to develop called a stereotype threat, which is if you've had a lot of experience of being stereotyped against, you go into new experiences feeling threatened that you're going to be stereotyped against. And that affects your behavior too. So it has this compounding effect. So yes, implicit bias really matters. It sets up all these things that have important effects on our community. So that's why we really care about this. That's why we want to do something about it, and that's why we want trying to turn our attention to it. So I made a little activity here for you all to participate in. And again, you can use the chat box or we can unmute you. So here's the activity. It is to find the implicit bias. And let's say there's a situation where the students say to their teacher, you know, we're having a lot of money problems in our family or in my individual life. And as their teacher, you search for financial literacy resources to help them. You want them to be able to, you want to help them address this challenge that they're facing. So you find a source that offers workshops such as tips for managing your money, how to make informed retirement decisions, use Google spreadsheets to make a budget, 3 strategies for saving for college. Now, those might all be very useful workshops for your students. Those workshops might have very important information that we all need to have access to. And there could be an implicit bias showing itself in this list of workshops. And so I want to ask you, any ideas there? Do you see a possible implicit bias? What do you think it might be? So I see Connie saying budgeting is a longer-term thinking and planning than many of my students do. College is expected here. So, okay, so the implicit bias is almost that budgeting is a good idea, that it's that kind of long-term budgeting is a good idea, and that college is expected. And also, you are all unmuted right now, so if anybody wants to chime in and just speak up, please feel free. We're doing a radical thing in the webinar here, which is just trying to invite your voices in. I see Laura saying you have to have money to begin with. That's a good point. Sherry says the assumption is that a person has disposable income not used up by data. Oh, yeah, right, the assumption that you have anything to even save. And Connie is affirming what Sherry said. Good. Any other implicit bias that might be here that anybody wants to offer?
How about the bias that they have a computer? I mean, that we just assume that they have access to technology and know how to use it, maybe?
Good point, good point. I want to highlight what Melissa wrote. She says, maybe assuming the difficulty is in managing the money, not getting paid enough. Now, that's kind of outside the box, right? Because these 4 bullet points are all about it's on you to individually manage yourself. And then Melissa's saying, well, maybe it's not just on this individual, but maybe.
Really scratchy, so this is.
Oh, maybe we should mute people. I hear people talking a lot.
I don't need anything to cover in my head.
So, thanks all for being part of the experiment.
Well, it was a good try.
Yeah, it was.
Mike, you can remute everybody.
Yeah, he's working on it. So yeah, just going off of Melissa's point here, which she got us way outside the box, going away from the individual, zooming way out and saying, well, what's the job situation? And maybe they should be earning more. Maybe there's something wrong with minimum wage, for example, or something like that. So yeah, so somebody else, also Allison R., is talking about wages and other external factors. Yeah. I remember reading something recently that talked about how somebody needed to go back to school to be able to afford medication because her son had diabetes. And that's of course something that she should be totally thinking about. But another way to zoom out from that is, wow, why do we not take care of people in our society when they get sick? Why don't we have health plans that work for people? You could also ask that question. So, okay, so lots going on here, and I see that it's 2:38, and I want to get over to the next part of the webinar, which is Andy talking a little bit more about what to do about bias. Before we get there, there's just one more thing here, and this is the change agent's special issue on the economic crisis. And I don't know if you can see the signs that people are holding, but it says it's time for an economy that works for everyone. And I thought, well, there's an implicit bias here, right? And rather than unmuting everybody, I'll just speak to the fact that, yeah, when the change agent sort of took on the economic crisis, we wanted to think about not just what individuals could do to weather the crisis, but what does the economy look like overall, and what do we need in an economy to have it work for everybody. So that's another form of, well, that actually might be explicit bias. It's not actually unconscious, but it's sort of underlying the approach there. Okay, Andy, over to you.
Okay, and I just want to build on what you just said when you said this is explicit bias. I think the key shift here about addressing implicit bias is trying to figure out how to make it explicit, how to make it visible, make the invisible visible. And as we were reading articles about this, I read a researcher who said, the world isn't divided into the not biased and the biased. It's divided into those who acknowledge that they have bias and those who don't acknowledge that they have bias, because we all have it. And I want to just go back to Cynthia's reference to the referees who were, with all that data collection and are shown to be implicitly biased in their referee calls. And that is that when they brought their attention to it, when they made them aware of their bias, their behavior changed. And so there's a lot of evidence that says, once you become aware of your bias, then it gives you a modicum of control over how you're going to respond to that. So here are some things that are strategies for addressing implicit bias. So for ourselves as educators, building our own self-awareness. So figuring out how to make the unconscious conscious, and it could be that we take one of those implicit bias tests, and that would be fine. Other suggestions are that we just start to intentionally slow down our decisions, our behaviors, so that we have a couple of more seconds to question ourselves about why we're saying what we're saying, why we're doing what we're doing. Just slow things down to give yourself some time to think. It's almost like that whole thing about, give your brain some time to process before it comes out of your mouth kind of thing. But the second thing, which I think is very important, is to just not be defensive about this whole phenomenon of implicit bias, that it's not a reflection on how good a person we are. This is something that is human. It is a human trait. And it's less likely that we're going to be able to address our own implicit biases if we're feeling shamed or blamed about it. And so we just have to keep telling ourselves that in order to grapple with it. There's this other suggestion to invite feedback, and one is to work with our colleagues to create some kind of an observation protocol. And just like I think about with assessment rubrics with students, the most valuable part of the rubric is the construction of it with your students, like what is it that we're looking for? I think that's the more powerful part than actually using it once it's done. But this would create the opportunity for us as educators to be talking to each other about what is it that we would think we would observe if we were to see implicit bias playing out in our classrooms. And that would be a really wonderful discussion for us to have. And then there's this other suggestion that we, when we do evaluations by students, when we collect student feedback, that we start including questions about, whether they feel like they've been affirmed, or whether the teacher has helped them express what they know, because students express knowledge in a variety of ways, and we may be biased towards certain ways of knowing and against other ways of knowing. So ways that are kind of just feeding us information consistently from our students about whether or not we're doing a good job about monitoring our biases. And a couple of other strategies here about some ways that we can monitor our practice. One has to do with checking ourselves about we're now with the CCR more and more attentive of, asking students for evidence of what they're saying. And we need to kind of monitor when we ask students for evidence. And I thought of this because I was reflecting on my own practice and realizing that I was more likely to ask a student to justify their answer with evidence if I disagreed with them than if I agreed with them. And I'm quite sure that's true. I'm sure I did that. But now that I'm aware of it, I would be more mindful about that. I'm going to keep going on this slide, and then I'm going to get over to the chat box. I see Melissa just wrote something, but I'm going to pause. Hold that for a second. Another thing has to do with wording of questions, being very careful that we're not loading our questions with suggesting what the right answer is within the question, but really constructing questions that we're really inviting an option, a variety of options for the answer, and that it's we're authentically asking for their responses, not kind of steering them in a particular direction. Then there's materials. We saw that horrific child's textbook with those images. We have lots of materials that are reflecting the experiences and the voices of certain demographics over other demographics, and are reinforcing certain messages about the world rather than other messages. And we can put our minds toward being more critically reflective of the materials we use. And of course, this is the time to do our shout out for the change agent, because Cynthia does an amazing job of really attending to that. And then considering our worldview, kind of being aware of what our own worldview is and what the dominant worldview is, so that we're always mindful of offering contrasting perspectives so that we can, that anti-confirmation bias, like trying to challenge what the normative view is. Just to question it, we may conclude that it's solid, but we are always asking questions about that. I'm going to pause now before I go to lessons and look in the chat box. So Melissa is saying, an example of implicit bias. Child care providers and doctors assume that I'm the one to interface with about my child, assume that my husband won't know the details. Yeah, right. Still, the husband is the babysitter as opposed to the parent. Yeah. And also, I feed into this, assuming that I'm the one who's responsible for knowing and keeping track of all the details. Yeah. Yeah, it's a long slog undoing our training. But, take heart. It's taken a lot of work to shape our consciousness the way it is. So it's going to take a bit of work to reshape it. Okay, so back to this slide. Another set of strategies relates to lessons we can do. So one has to do with, learning about bias and watching these videos about examples of bias and the way, and especially confirmation bias. At the end, we're going to share some links to resources, many of which are these short videos that show you people just not seeing what's right in front of their eyes. It's very interesting. Students would be very engaged by it. And so actually just putting the topic of bias and implicit bias right on the table for study would be really wonderful. And it would bring in all kinds of text about reading about how, we're social animals and we naturally form in-groups and out-groups. And so, we tend to see our in-group as individuals. We're more likely to accept differences among people in our in-group and more likely to remember the positive attributes of our in-group and more likely to help people in our in-group. And people who are in however we define the out-group are more likely to be treated as homogenous, and it's kind of like just generalizations about their behavior. And we're less likely to do all those things, less likely to help them, less likely to attribute positive attributes to them, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of material for digging in and exploring this with students. Also, they say just deeper listening to other experiences besides your own and focusing and giving students practice in that is just going to take us a step further down the road in the right direction. Of course, that deeper listening is going to help us in a million ways in the world. And then these last two I'm going to put together because I'm going to show you something. And so this is one is, don't conflate explicit bias, which are opinions, with implicit bias. So a lot of times people will say, just call an opinion a bias. And it's not, and it's very explicit. It's like, well, we're not talking about those explicit opinions that you know you have. We're talking about the things that are underneath that, and don't understand that those are two different things and need to be treated distinctly. And we'll look at that in a second. And related to that is this example of your worldview. There's so much that we believe implicitly about our worldview that we're not necessarily conscious of. As Cynthia said, the whole idea of that we tend toward individualism, like just all those things about our culture that we are steeped in. I want to show you, so anyway, lessons that kind of try to surface that as much as possible. And I'm going to show you an activity I did out in a community group. It was not an adult ed class or setting, but we were trying to look at the difference between opinions and the underlying bias. So I took these two opinions. They're considered kind of like, people might naturally call them more conservative and liberal opinions. So, but we'll just say the first opinion is that immigrants take our jobs and lower our wages. And then a contrasting opinion is that immigrants are good for our economy and do the jobs nobody else wants to do, and our food would be unaffordable if it weren't for immigrant labor. And so, therefore, we should be supportive of, welcoming immigrants into our country as opposed to, pushing them out. So, in the group I was talking with, these were like the two opinions that felt like these are the two opposing perspectives. And I asked them, what is the underlying bias or the underlying assumptions that sit beneath both of these opinions? And they worked in groups and came up with some really wonderful, rich answers. And before I show you what the kind of thing they said, I'm wondering if anybody wants to put in a chat box any thoughts you have about what is an implicit bias that sits underneath, kind of unconsciously, under these two separate opinions. Okay, Sherry says there's a bias that all immigrants are unskilled and do menial labor. Absolutely, right? Both of these treat immigrants as a separate workforce, like separate from us. Yeah, Immigrants are not us, right? It's them. Immigrants should have low-wage jobs. Yeah, and they should, because sometimes people will say, well, hey, it's better than life in their country. So let me show you what folks in the room said for the implicit bias. And when they examined it, they decided in various groups, if immigrants aren't good for the economy, we don't want them. There would be no use. And if a person doesn't serve a purpose, they provide a good to us, they're disposable. So if they're not useful to us, that's why we want them here, because they're useful to us. And if they're not useful to us, and when they start discussing this underlying assumption that was resting underneath these opinions, many of them were uncomfortable and decided, I don't want to be driven. I don't want my opinion to be driven by this underlying belief. I believe some other things about humanity and human dignity and human worth. And they started, the last part of the workshop was to kind of construct an opinion that better reflected the underlying assumptions and beliefs and values that they did have. So it's one way to kind of help students, just surface what is underneath what they believe. And in doing that, you take more control over how you want to move forward and how you're going to construct your beliefs in the future and your behavior and your decisions. So Sandy, who do you say the they was in this activity? Teachers? No, these were just community members, people who were in my neighborhood at a community group. So it wasn't an adult ed context. We were just looking at doing some learning together. Great. Okay. So I think we're coming to the end here. Let me just see if there's anything on my. Oh, I want to bring you to the resources. I guess I should just wrap up by just reiterating that really what we're getting at is, obviously making the invisible visible and interrogating some of our unexplored beliefs that shape our unexamined surface views and behaviors and the way we're treating people. So,
and can I just add one thing there, Andy?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that just as teachers out in the classroom or as people doing professional development for teachers, we have a possibility to help bring about some change here. Because if you remember, education is one of the key sources of where implicit bias comes from. So it's the materials that we use, it's how we coach other teachers, it's the kind of ripple effect of what we do in education. It's pretty profound. So it's great to be able to embrace the opportunity here to address implicit bias in our work.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what I have on this slide is some of the favorite video clips that we found that we thought were the most useful. The one that you watched of the numbers is the Can You Solve This at Veritasium. And if you go to the Veritasium website, there are like dozens of fabulous little videos exploring math and science concepts. That's great. Okay, and if anyone knows of other resources and you want to jot it in the chat box as we're closing up, I think people are eager to find new things that they can use. And I'm going to end by thanking you for being here this afternoon with us. And if you would like to share this webinar, we archive the recordings of all our webinars at NELRC.org in the resources section. And you will also be sent the link, let's see, and the slides. I think that's what you'll get. And if you'd be so generous to do the little 4-question webinar evaluation that pops up at the end, we'd appreciate it very much. It helps us justify our work to our funders, and that's always important for all of us. Thank you, Mike, for setting us up in a challenging situation with Cynthia's computer and helping everyone who is with us today stay connected. Okay, thank you. Heidi has a book she's putting in there. Great, thank you. Oh, Stacey Abrams' experience, fabulous. Thank you all. Thanks, Cynthia.
Thanks to you, Andy. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. Goodbye.
Bye.